And joining us now to talk about the Orlando attack from a national security perspective is former Homeland Security Advisor to President George Bush, Fran Townsend, and former Deputy CIA Director and CBS News Senior Security Contributor, Michael Morrell. Michael, let me start with you. Put this event in context with the larger war against terrorism and ISIS.
So I think the best way, John, to do that is to talk about the CIA Director's testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee on Thursday, which I think is the most candid, accurate statement we've heard from an administration official. John said three things. One is that despite the success we've had in Iraq and Syria against ISIS, the terrorist capability of ISIS overseas has not yet been degraded. That was number one. Number two, the terrorist threat is going to get worse before it gets better, because as we put pressure on ISIS in Iraq and Syria, all those Westerners who went to fight there are going to come home, right? And they're going to think about conducting attacks. And three, it's not just about Iraq and Syria anymore in terms of defeating ISIS. It's now about defeating them wherever they've spread in the world, in particular to Libya now.
Fran, when you look at this event, it seems that the shooter in this case, declared allegiance, but at the day of the attack. How much of a connection do you see between ISIS and this massacre?
Well, let's be honest. He's at various points, we now know he claimed allegiance to ISIS just before the attack, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah, which is a Shia extremist group, right? And so it's not clear. He clearly was mentally ill, and what his ties are have not been made clear yet. One of the things we know that investigators are looking at are his social media. They've not made that public. That may shed some light. We know that there are ongoing investigations overseas looking at his travel to Saudi Arabia on Hajj. And so I think it remains to be seen whether or not he had any direct ties to ISIS or any terrorist group.
So, Mike, if this is a person who just claimed allegiance at the 11th hour, does that have national security implications? Which is, there's obviously a call from the electorate for a response.
Right.
We have in this debate seen some people argue that the response creates more problems. And some of the, Omar Mateen at one point talked about what the United States was doing. So he wasn't saying, I support ISIS because of their desires about a caliphate. He was angry at the U.S. counterterrorism efforts.
Right.
So is there a national security implication to the way this is responded to?
So I think that it's, I think he was a lone wolf. I think we're going to find out that he was not directed, right? So I think he was a lone wolf. Self-radicalized, talked to not very many people about his views, right? It's very difficult for intelligence and law enforcement to find, to discover, and to disrupt lone wolves, right? So we really need the help of the community, of the family and friends to give us warnings, right, about these kind of people. That's the way you have to deal with it. And when you start talking about broad surveillance against Muslims, when you start talking about going into mosques, when you start talking about shutting down mosques, you make it more difficult for the Muslim community to want to reach out and have a relationship with law enforcement.
Fran, the Attorney General mentioned that because they have limited access to online behavior, it would be hard to have seen the self-radicalization that went on. But if self-radicalization is what happened between when the FBI stopped its looking into Mr. Mateen, did there need to be some new tools to capture the self-radicalization that happens with lone wolves?
Absolutely. So the Attorney General has what's called domestic investigation operational guidelines that apply. What it basically does is the internal regulations of the Justice Department about how the FBI conducts its investigations within the law. And so they need to review those guidelines to decide, are they too restrictive? So I'll give you an example, John. I have a social media account, and any journalist could follow it and sort of report on it because I make those statements public. The AG's guidelines restrict when and how the FBI can look at that. And the question is, if when we find out, we learn more about what he was posting on Facebook and social media, there may have been clues to his self-radicalization, the cycle of violence and how he was getting closer to being violent. maybe if we relook at those guidelines and loosen those guidelines and allow the FBI access to that sooner, it's yet another fact that they can factor in as they make those assessments.
Like in the battle against ISIS overseas, there's been developments in Fallujah. Explain what they mean. How much do they mean in this battle?
So it's essentially, the fight for Fallujah is essentially over. There's some cleanup operations that need to be done. There's still some ISIS fighters in Fallujah, but it's basically over. I think it's important strategically and tactically. Strategically, Fallujah was the first city to fall to ISIS, so taking it back sends an important message. Tactically, it was the location from where the ISIS suicide bombers were leaving to go to Baghdad to conduct the hundreds of attacks that have taken place there. So tactically, it's important to take that city away from them because it was so close to Baghdad. There are now a number of cities between Fallujah and Mosul, and they're going to have to take each one of those in succession. So we're probably still months away from Fallujah, from Mosul, but this is certainly an important step.
Is there any way in which it can degrade the kind of allure of the Islamic State that a lone wolf might be attracted to?
So I think that is part of our messaging, right? That needs to be part of our messaging about they've lost now 50% of their caliphate in both Iraq and Syria. That is a message we should be getting out, and our partners should be getting out for that exact purpose.
Fran, the last question to you. It used to be when we talked about terrorism in the United States, we talked about bombs. Now it seems to me, at least in the last two, there have been semi-automatic weapons used. Is that a notable shift? Is it an important shift? How do you read that?
You know, Adam Gaddan, an al-Qaeda member, called for the use of guns and terrorist attacks going back almost 10 years ago. And really, we've seen San Bernardino and we've seen Orlando. I'm concerned that we're going to see more of these types of attacks. And I think that as we look at going forward, we've got to look at how can we reduce the lethality of these attacks? How can we interrupt the cycle of violence? And one of the things we've got to consider, among many things, is whether or not that the ban on assault weapons, AR-15s, the larger size ammunition clips is a piece to a larger puzzle. It won't stop it. We've seen Oslo, we've seen in countries, Paris, Brussels, where they get weapons if they want them. It's not the only answer, but reducing the lethality is important and we ought to look at it.
All right, Fran and Mike, thank you so much. We'll be back in a moment to talk about the week in politics. We're back with Ruth Marcus, columnist and deputy editorial page editor at The Washington Post, and Washington Post columnist Michael Gerson. Mike, I want to start with you. You worked for a president who, after 9/11, was very careful about how he spoke about Muslims in America. Donald Trump is talking about his ban on Muslim immigration and now the idea of profiling.
Right.
What's your reaction?
Well, even going further, he attacked the Muslim community for not being cooperative enough. He intimated that the President of the United States may be a jihadist agent, which goes pretty far. This is very, very dangerous in the daily conduct of the war against terrorism, which requires cooperative communities in the United States and cooperation with allies abroad. All of our allies in this fight, most of them, are in fact Muslim allies. So this is, deeply self-destructive, but it also has just raised huge concerns in the minds of Republicans. It was a test. Is this guy pivoting? Is he ready? And in fact, he failed the test dramatically.
What about on the Democratic side, Ruth? The test, Hillary Clinton had the same test. What's your grade of her?
I thought she got a good grade. I thought, it's all about the baseline and it's all about the curve. And so when your contest is against Donald Trump, anybody is going to look pretty good when he's talking the way he was talking about Muslims, the Muslim community, and President Obama. But I think that, we're at this very interesting moment as we talk about Muslims and Islamic terror and as we talk about national security, where I think you may be starting to see a shift in the gun debate. Now, nobody should ever think that changing gun laws in this country is easy, but as we begin to talk about guns as a question of not just gun control, but as a question of national security. That's really a potential opening here. In terms of Secretary Clinton, she came out and I thought said the right things and in fact the right words about this horrible tragedy in Orlando.
Like, one thing she did say that was a bit of a change is she said, well, I'll call it radical Islam, I'll call it, whatever. Well, the president has been very specific about his language. A lot of people have said that suggests that he doesn't see the picture clearly. Why do the words matter here? And was it a big shift that Hillary Clinton basically adopted what many, including Donald Trump, have said she should have been saying all along?
Well, I think there's a lot of people that have this conviction that the words determine outcomes, and they don't really. When I was in the White House, the State Department had a view on the words we should use, CIA had a view on the words we should use, even internally within the government, they disagree about words that are used. But I think that most people are going to view Hillary Clinton as a little bit to the right of Barack Obama on foreign policy and security. She certainly was on the Syrian issue internally. She pointed that out in her book, that she disagreed with the president on these issues. I view that probably as an advantage. She is going to be seen as a more hawkish alternative to President Obama. That's probably an advantage.
And saying the words just gets the issue off the table, and then you can move on to a real debate about what we should be doing.
So you think it's off the table? I don't think they're going to let it go, because the president is still adamant.
No, it off the table as it relates to the party's nominee. So he can say that, he can claim that he pushed her into doing it, but the real debate has to be not about, as Mike said, not about the words that we use, but the policies that we implement.
The Gallup poll shows that Republicans see this as a terrorist event, Democrats see it as a gun control event. Everybody goes to their corners right away.
Welcome to America.
Yeah.
Look, I think, as I was saying before, smart people should understand it, because it is understandable as both, and we need to address it as both. And there is never going to be a, I'm tempted to say, silver bullet solution to this. But if we can have incremental changes along the lines that a lot of your guests were talking about today, we may be able to stem some of this violence, not all of it.
Mike, if this was a test for Donald Trump, and Republican leaders have obviously not supported his idea of a Muslim immigration ban, what do those leaders do? What's the state of the...
Well, I think that Republican leaders like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan have proven that it doesn't matter what Trump says, they're willing to swallow it. He has already accused his opponent of possible complicity in murder, and now he's accused the president of treason. There's nothing they won't take. But the thing that's changing in the polling is support among Republicans. And that, I think, all of a sudden, if it looks like the House of Representatives is at risk, if it looks like a debacle, a disaster, you're going to find Republicans all across the country rediscovering their conscience when it comes to Donald Trump. And we're on that verge. Republicans are at a stage of panic in the Republican National Committee, many. The question is whether they're going to move to a state of revolt. And that's, I think, what we're going to see in the next 2 weeks.
Ruth, on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders seems to be moving down a pathway, but he hasn't gotten all the way there. And his campaign manager said 3 different times when asked if he was still running, he said yes. So where do things stand on the Democratic side?
Well, not where they stood in 2008 when Hillary Clinton made her famous speech about the 18 million cracks in the glass ceiling. I went back and looked at that. In that speech, there were 16 references to Barack Obama. They were all about the notion that it was essential for the party to get together, to work as hard as it could to elect Barack Obama, not to stop his opponent, but to elect Barack Obama. Bernie Sanders, you would not use the word gracious to describe his speech. He mentioned Hillary Clinton 3 times in the notion of he sat down and had a meeting with her, and he still had strong disagreements with her. The question for Senator Sanders is really, is this the most useful employment for him of the power that he has, or does he risk dissipating his influence with the party as it moves on and understands, as he did say, that the real goal for the party needs to be defeating Donald Trump?
All right, Ruth Marcus, Michael Gerson, thank you both for being with us on a very packed show. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. That's it for us today, but before we go, we want to wish all the fathers out there a happy Father's Day. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.